Thank you very much, Ralph, and it's a real pleasure to be invited here and to be called distinguished. I feel slightly undeserving of the title, but nevertheless, thank you very much. Thank you to Ambassador Ong, as well as Dr. Emmers, for inviting me and hosting me so generously at RSIS. It's an enormous pleasure to connect with some old friends and colleagues here. I was here indeed with my wife and son, who are in the front row, and he was born in I think NUS Hospital back then, so he's now 17, so you can work out exactly how long it was really since I spent an extended time in Singapore. But it's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you too to the National Trade Unions Congress for making all of this possible. Ralph has given a very good introduction. I will mention and plug the book a little later on, but this work extends some of the work in the book that myself and a colleague, former colleague from the London School of Economics, Jeffrey Schweroth, and I wrote, as Ralph said, published in March earlier this year. But it extends it in that it focuses much more on the question of wealth shocks, and particularly crisis-related wealth shocks, collapses in housing prices, in pension assets, and in other important assets which have become increasingly part of middle-class lifestyles across the developed world and much of the aspiring middle class in many countries. And we believe that these financial shocks that many people have suffered really for the past decade or more are really quite consequential in terms of the way that politics has become more polarized, and we see a quite rapid and recent emergence of so-called political populism in a number of countries. Now, I don't want to put you off your lunch, but I do think that the shocks, including the political shocks that we're seeing in the United States and the United Kingdom, both leaders eating populist foods, I guess. For those eagle-eyed among you, Boris Johnson's ice cream is melting down his hand and probably going down his sleeve, so I guess that's symbolic. But these are populist leaders of mainstream political parties. So we're very familiar with these, and we're seeing upheavals in foreign policies in these two leading powers that were associated with the emergence not only of a so-called liberal international order, but broadly some of the big multilateral institutions that many of the academics based at RSIS study consistently. There are, however, a number of populist political parties that have emerged in recent years, so not associated with mainstream political parties of the centre-right and centre-left, but you've probably heard of Fidesz, that's Mr. Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister's party in Hungary. UKIP, of course, made famous by Nigel Farage, one of the most successful populists in Europe, and in many ways tearing Europe apart as we speak. The Sweden Democrats, there in the middle, a nice blue and yellow flower. You may, of course, from where I'm now based in Australia, you may have heard of Pauline Hanson and One Nation, but you might not have heard of the Love Australia or Leave It party, which claims that Australia is completely full, which will probably be news to Singaporeans. With a future projected population of 10 million. Australia only has 25 million. I've been involved with colleagues in developing a global database on populist politics, and we code parties when they signify populist rhetoric, such as the people versus the elite. So Donald Trump, Boris Johnson are experts at using this kind of language in polarizing the political system, and in their case dragging mainstream centre-right parties further to the extreme. But when we count some of the many other populist parties that have as their kind of signature the people versus the elite of various forms. And when we take that back to the 1980s, we see the number of votes in democratic systems, at least, where populist parties and parties that are captured by populists, including Donald Trump's Republican Party from 2016, when we include this, we see the average vote share going to populist parties in over, 450 elections in 58 countries since 1980, rising quite sharply. So a general upward trend. That's the top blue line. You can see the black dotted line. That's right-wing populist parties. So that would include, for example, Fidesz in Hungary, and left-wing populist parties, the red dotted line in the bottom, rising less clearly, but there's a significant upward trend there. An example of a left populist party is Podemos in Spain. Now, what I hope to persuade you of over the course of the next 40 minutes or so is that this populist trend is linked to what Jeff Schweroth and I call the wealth effect. This is a picture of rising real per capita wealth in advanced countries since 1870. And we like to, with some deference to Al Gore's hockey stick for global average temperatures, we like to call this the wealth hockey stick, because you can see quite a rapid upward shift in real per capita wealth in these, 8 or 9, maybe 10 advanced economies. And it's all pretty much the same story. In 1970, on average in US dollar terms, on a per capita basis, real wealth measured in 2015 dollars, so we're taking account of inflation in this, was about $50,000 per head. So that includes things like housing wealth, pension wealth that I'll come back to. By 2000, on average, it was about $200,000. So in real terms, there's a massive increase in wealth in these advanced economies over time. Now, of course, behind averages, and these are average rates, there's a lot of divergence and a lot of detail and a lot of cleavages that I'll talk about, and which we believe are driving some of these populist developments. Now, there's a lot of work in political science, political economy in recent years that makes the argument that this wealth effect that you can see, at least in part in that previous graphic, is having rising important consequences for politics. And this is what political scientists refer to as asset dominance, as opposed to income dominance. So in the post-war period, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, after the Great Depression and after John Maynard Keynes taught everyone how to stabilize economies by using macroeconomic policy, there was a heavy focus on income and employment. So the objective of governments after the Great Depression and after 1945 in particular was to stabilize income from employment. But we're now living in a world where wealth and assets are far more important to the middle segment, who are, of course, the dominant voting segment in most democracies, and this is what we mean by asset dominance. So personal wealth in the form of housing, pension assets, financial wealth, but also, as I'll talk a bit about later, education. Education is what economists refer to as human capital. So education is also an asset, and an increasingly important asset for the aspirant middle class. So from a household, personal perspective, these kinds of assets are buffers against bad life events. Illness, they're buffers against unemployment, income shocks, and all sorts of other things. And some of the interesting work in political science has shown that as people get wealthier, they also have declining support for welfare states. So in a number of European countries and in North America and Australasia and so on, we see falling support amongst those segments of the middle class that have become much wealthier, who say, look, I've got plenty of savings. Therefore, don't tax me to redistribute social welfare spending towards those people who, in my view, are undeserving of assistance. So rising polarization in many of these countries, as particularly the top end of the middle class, increasingly does not necessarily support the kinds of welfare policies that in the past they did in the 1960s, let's say, to the 1980s or so. Of course, this kind of wealth is also strongly associated with social status and with social mobility and economic mobility, as well as increasingly political divides within the middle class, between those relatively satisfied in the middle class who've got plenty of savings as a personal buffer and who don't want to redistribute income towards the relatively poor, for example. Social and spatial divides over housing. So we see asset price, particularly house price inflation. I don't have to tell Singaporeans about house price inflation. But in big cities, from London to New York to San Francisco, we see house price inflation closely connected to access to good schools, education, really crucial for the middle class. So people like to locate nearby good schools, good universities and so on, driving up asset prices and creating asset price inequality within cities, countries and regions. Now, I'm sure that someone will ask this, because people normally do, isn't that massive increase in wealth primarily the top 5%, the top 1%? So isn't that average driven up by a massive accumulation of wealth by the very, very wealthiest in these advanced wealthy societies, and this would include Singapore? Actually, the answer is no. So the middle class have been big beneficiaries of rapidly accumulating housing wealth. Pension assets in most countries were insignificant before 1945, and they were built up over time, and the major beneficiaries of big pension holdings, again in countries like Australia, have been the middle class. Education assets have primarily benefited the middle class, as we've seen the spread of education. Typically, university level education was confined to the elite. In 1945, in most countries, less than 5% of people went to university, and that was true in Singapore, I believe, in the 1970s. But now we're seeing education spread out to the middle class. And we have been over the past few decades. And this is driving, because many of these assets are associated with social status and there's a competition for scarce housing, scarce good education assets and so on. This is driving asset price inflation and driving political and social divides upwards. This provides some evidence that the wealth increase that I showed you earlier is not just a product of accumulation at the very top. So the blue lines across these four major countries, if you can see it, measure the share of the wealthiest 10% of the population across these four major developed economies. And what we see since the early 1810s, so this data, we're beneficiaries of a lot of really good economic work that's been done by Thomas Piketty and others in recent years to accumulate a lot of data on wealth and income shares. And what we can see here is the wealth share of the top 10% collapsing after World War II. So on average, something like 30 to 40% or so, sometimes more in the case of Sweden, of total societal wealth is held by the middle class. If we think about the middle class as broadly everyone below the 90th percentile, so the poorest 90% of households. You can see that wealth inequality has kicked up, particularly in the United States and also the UK since the 1980s, but we're not yet back to the kind of Belle Epoque levels of inequality that prevailed before World War I in most of these countries. This just gives you a picture, again, across 6 major economies, from France to the United States on your right. This just gives you a picture of the distribution of societal wealth, and this is total personal household assets, of the middle 3 quintiles. So that means all households from the 20th percentile up to the 80th percentile. So in 20 percentile chunks, you can see the blue at the top. Those are the households in what we might broadly call the lower middle class in these 6 countries. owning something like 5 to 10% of all household wealth. And you can see as we move up from the 40th to the 60th, and then from the 60th to the 80th percentile, we're moving into the upper middle class. We see, of course, a larger share. These are the people with more assets, more houses, more pensions, and so on, more financial assets generally, and typically also more education assets. And the total size of these bars, again, the United States is an outlier. You see, at least on this definition of the middle class, owning about 20% of all household wealth in the United States, but up to, nearly 40% in countries like Spain and Italy, 35 to 40% of all household wealth. So the middle class is really important and really consequential in political terms. This picture, again, don't worry too much about the detail at the bottom. It's the same 6 countries basically, but all this shows you is that in terms of gross wealth, so that if we leave out debt, I'll come back to that in a second, if we leave out debt, housing assets are by far the most important component of wealth, again, for these middle 3 quintiles. That's from the 20th percentile to the 80th, so the people in the middle of this distribution. So the 60% of people who are typically most consequential in terms of voting. Housing is the most important form of wealth that these people hold, followed by things like pensions, savings, and in some cases business assets. Now there are, as I mentioned earlier, growing wealth divides within the middle class, and this includes growing wealth divides between new economy workers, and so we might think of much of the activity in central Singapore as in the new economy, in high technology sectors, in banking and finance, knowledge-intensive sectors. Old economy workers who may once have been middle class, but who are stuck in declining industries, in declining sectors, and worried increasingly that the aspirations that they had for their children to attain and to maintain middle class status are increasingly under threat. These are the sorts of people who voted for Brexit and who voted for Donald Trump in November 2016. The old economy workers who feel as though they're just hanging on, they're being squeezed. I believe in Singapore you have a nice term for this, the sandwich class. This includes also some people who may be young and aspirational, perhaps currently in university, but worried as to whether they can ever afford to buy an apartment, a house, to attain middle class status in the way that their parents may have done. We see massive and new divides between booming urban centers in the United States. Think about Boston, San Francisco, New York, Seattle. Booming knowledge-intensive cities and rural regions that are being left behind. Rural regions where a lot of manufacturing activity used to be located and where factories often have disappeared, and that's related to the so-called China shock that a lot of academic work has focused on in recent years, but also to the outer suburbs in cities that haven't been experiencing the kind of asset price inflation. So declining suburbs relative to booming inner city regions. In my part of Melbourne, inner city housing has gone through the roof. This is also true in Sydney, just as it is in places like London, New York, and I guess you get that effect in Singapore as well. Inner city and peripheral suburbs, divides between these and also between generations. So I've already mentioned the way that comfortable middle-class lifestyles were often acquired certainly by my parents growing up in Australia. They weren't particularly educated. In my case, my mother went to teachers training college at university. My father didn't. But nevertheless, in Australia, it was quite easy, being in what we might call broadly today the semi-skilled class, to attain middle-class status. That's increasingly no longer possible. So sometimes younger generations, particularly those with lots of knowledge assets and the right kinds of skills to go into the knowledge-intensive industries, will often be richer and wealthier than their parents, but often not. So often those people who made it into the middle class, at what we might call broadly the middle and lower middle class, increasingly worried that their children might not be as well off as they are currently. Now, wealth, as I've already suggested, is a funny thing. It's different to income. Wealth, in terms of assets, has strong, what we would call relational aspects. That is, it depends on the kinds of connections, societal and economic connections that people have. It is often highly networked in that the value of my house depends on the value of my neighbours' houses. The value of my education depends in part on where I went to university, what kinds of connections I made at university. These are network benefits of acquiring wealth. And if you're a member of the right kinds of networks, it can make an enormous difference. So we see rising levels of asset and of course income inequality across many societies that are related to these relational and network aspects. And finally, spatial attributes. Housing is the best example of this. Housing determines your ability to access housing. Where you live may determine which kinds of schools your children can get into, what kinds of access to good schools you have, the kinds of educational networks that your children move in, and that may shape in turn their life prospects, including their prospects for accumulating further assets, or not. And we see, as I mentioned earlier, lots of competition for good schools in good areas, in good, safe suburbs, in a lot of cities. And my family and I certainly experience that in London, but it's also at work in places like Melbourne, and I imagine too in Singapore, even if in a different way. This is a picture of the kind of asset price inflation, or I should say it's not just asset price inflation when we refer to education. This is across all rich OECD countries. So there's about 35 rich economies in the OECD. So that organization is based in Paris, and they aggregate statistics right across the board from a number of countries. And what they've shown, the bottom black line shows average cost inflation. So CPI inflation, consumer price index inflation, averaged across all rich economies since 1996, which is just made to equal 100. So on average, inflation has been about 80% since that time. But if you look at the cost of education, it's more than doubled. If you look at the cost of healthcare, it's gone up significantly more, and certainly in some countries, above all the United States, the cost of healthcare has gone up. And you see the cost of housing and education tracking together quite closely for the reasons that I just mentioned. So this is creating a kind of sandwich effect. So in societies like the United States, like the United Kingdom, where we see this populist blowback, these people are not just feeling squeezed by asset price inflation and the difficulty of accessing good education, good schools and so on. They're increasingly worried about living longer, having larger healthcare costs, old age care. The cost of that has been accelerating far above the rate of inflation, average cost inflation. Worried about whether they might have to pay for their children's education, or at least chip into their children's or grandchildren's education and so on. So this is what is generally referred to by the OECD, which wrote a large report on this earlier this year, as the middle class squeeze. So the Singapore sandwich class is a global problem. Now, before we get too depressed about prospects for the young, in some respects the young are better off than their parents. This picture shows basically if you're a child with parents in their 50s and 60s, this shows the average level of education for tertiary qualifications, again, across all of the countries for which the OECD collects data. And that goes from South Africa on your far left, because you won't be able to read that, I'm afraid, to South Korea at the far right. So the generational transformation in the acquisition of education assets in South Korea is enormous. For parents in the 55 to 64-year-old cohort, the probability of having a tertiary education is about 20%. For their children, it's 70%. So Korea is one of the most educated middle-class countries on the planet. Singapore, I'm afraid, is not on the graphic, but I suspect that Singapore is over to the far right here. That typically parents will have much less in the way of tertiary education qualifications, and increasingly well over a majority of young people are going and getting some form of tertiary qualification, whether a university degree or some form of technical training. The OECD average, parents again with about 27% tertiary qualifications. That would include my mother with a teacher's qualification, but about 45% of all OECD younger people today. And of course, the people in their early 20s will have higher rates. So the trend has certainly been up over time. But people are anxious, people are worried, people are stressed. The rise of wealth has not been accompanied by rising satisfaction, contentment, and happiness. The middle class around the world is stressed and anxious, and that's particularly true of the middle and lower middle class. The risks, so if you're in that middle cohort in the income and wealth distribution, in this case the income distribution, so if you're anywhere in the middle from the 20th percentile to the 80th percentile, so neither rich nor poor, the probability for those a household in that 60% segment falling into the bottom segment over the whole of the OECD country database has risen for the lower middle class. So if you're basically in the bottom half of the middle class, the risk that you can fall into relative poverty has increased quite significantly in a number of countries since the 1990s. But for the relatively comfortable upper middle class, so think about basically, say, the 75th percentile upwards, with lots of assets, particularly high levels of education, the right kinds of skills for the new knowledge economy, these people are increasingly at less risk. This is a middle class divide, and reflecting that rising levels of anxiety at the bottom. The OECD surveys the level of anxiety, and they have an annual survey called The Risks That Matter. It's not very pleasant reading. I'd urge you, if you're interested, to go and have a look at it. It's freely available online. But people are asked to list their top 3 concerns, and when they do, so well over half say their major concerns are becoming ill or disabled and not being able to pay for it in their older age. Top 3 concern, financial security in old age. So people are less optimistic than in the past that they'll have a comfortable, happy, and healthy retirement. For 18 to 29-year-olds, the fear that they will not attain the comfort and the status, again, emphasis on status, being in the middle class, is a top 3 concern for well over half of this cohort, and even more interesting, I think, for 60% of parents. So nearly 2/3 of all parents are stressed that their children will not attain or maintain middle class status. So there's a kind of, I know people talk about the precariat, and I guess, again, this is what people mean when referring to the sandwich class. So we've coined this term, the wealth precariat, and it refers to a certain segment of either the aspirational middle class or the actual middle class, who were middle class in the past, but fear increasingly that they may not be able to hang on to that status. People who aspire to acquire or to maintain the kinds of assets associated with middle class status, but fear that their ability to do so has become increasingly uncertain, and their prospects declining over time, including for their children. If you look at, again, at education, the acquisition of education assets, it matters enormously what kind of family you're born into. So, for example, again, across this is an average across the whole OECD of 35 or so countries. About 2/3 of children of parents with tertiary qualifications. So if your parents have gone to university, the probability that you will go to university is very high, about 2/3. But if your parents only have, this may not be true of Singapore, by the way, but if your parents don't have a secondary school certificate, the probability across the OECD of the children going to university is only 15% on average. This is a massive failure of social mobility and policies, post-war policies aimed at promoting social mobility. Upward mobility, particularly for those people at the bottom, is under serious challenge in a number of OECD countries. So this is an average, but it indicates a general problem. One of the big problems with things like rising house prices and also the rising cost of education, good schools, good universities, aspirational middle-class Chinese or even Australians or Singaporeans wishing to send their children to Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Oxford, LSE, Cambridge, and so on. The cost of education, of course, has gone through the roof for many of these families. If you want to acquire the assets associated with middle-class status, increasingly what we see is that many middle-class families and individuals have had to turn to leverage, to debt, to achieve this. So we see a rising reliance on debt for the acquisition of housing assets, also secondary assets like cars, even flat-screen televisions, but in particular education as well. You've probably all heard of the problem that Elizabeth Warren likes to talk about, the problem of student debt in the United States, a ticking time bomb, according to the Democratic Party. Now, so the middle class has been acquiring, and I'll give you some statistics in a second, or in graphic indication. The middle class has been acquiring much of its wealth through rising leverage, but much of its wealth is therefore connected to the financial system and to financial stability. And this is what we talk about in our book, The Wealth Effect. So increasingly, housing assets and values are connected to the banking system, of course. The banking system in turn securitizes the mortgage and adds it up with lots of other mortgages and sells it on to investors. So insurance companies, pension funds, and other big financial asset funds are increasingly linked to this process. Pensions have been privatized, often in many countries across the rich world and many in the emerging world as well. And increasingly they've shifted towards so-called DC pension schemes, defined contribution, which means that the value of your pension in old age is no longer fixed. It depends on how financial markets perform. This increases risk and increases anxiety for the middle class. This is a picture of the United States, again for the top 10%, the darker grey line, the lighter grey line it's right the first time. The top 10% are the black lines and the bottom of both panels. So the top 10% of households lined up in the wealth distribution. So the richest 10%, housing is unimportant to them. Housing assets are not important for relatively wealthy Americans. If you think about one of the wealthiest Americans, Bill Gates, his house might be worth $50 million or $100 million, I don't know, but it's a very small fraction of his total wealth, okay? That's basically what that's showing. But that's true for the top 10% or so, but it's not true for the middle two quartiles. So the households in the middle of the wealth distribution in the United States, the middle 25th to the 75th percentile, housing assets by 2000 constituted about 100% of net wealth for American households. Okay, so most of their wealth was their house. You can also see for the light grey line at the top, increasingly that house was acquired through borrowing. Massive expansion of the mortgage market since 1945 has allowed the middle class to purchase increasingly expensive houses over time. Again, the top 10% doesn't need debt. Typically, they can purchase houses without the need for much debt. So these people are less leveraged, less at risk from financial shocks. These pictures, I'll just leave you with those. On your left, this is advanced countries on average since 1870. credit to GDP, so this is the amount of credit in the economy. Emerging countries in the middle since 1860, and developing countries on your right since 1860. And again, we can basically see that in all of these countries, the amount of debt in the system is going up quite sharply. So this is not just an advanced economy problem. That's the wealth effect, so go out and buy it. What is it? What do we argue in the book? Well, basically that because many middle-class voters have lots of wealth, and lots of wealth at risk of financial instability, financial shocks, that they acquire great expectations that governments ought to protect and promote that wealth, because it's increasingly important to them to maintain and to acquire middle-class status. And that includes within crises. So we find this very powerful effect over time that countries that acquire more wealth, governments are also under more pressure to promote and to protect that wealth. So that makes sense, particularly in democracies, but not only democracies. Governments are typically responsive to this. So governments provide more, and in crises they provide very costly interventions to protect that wealth, as they did in much of the advanced world from 2007 right through, in Italy's case, to 2017, 2018, bailing out banks, protecting depositors, making sure that interest rates fell to levels such that households, or at least too many households, were not losing their house when they became unemployed, and so on, in the Great Recession that followed the global financial crisis. So costly interventions, and that includes not only crisis interventions, it includes increasing amounts of government expenditure on things like education. Great expectations, however, produce great disappointments, just like in the novel by Charles Dickens. Wealth shocks, so even when governments intervene to protect wealth in crises, we show that wealth still falls quite sharply often. In many countries. So whatever governments do, they protect asset values, but they can't do everything to protect asset values. Equity markets still fall, even if much less than in the absence of interventions. House prices often still fall, even if much less than would have been the case had governments not intervened. Unfortunately for governments, these kinds of interventions, things like quantitative easing, which, as you'll see in a minute, boosted asset prices, particularly equity prices, across the OECD world, strengthen the perception among many people, including average households, that there's something unfair, deeply unfair, about what governments are doing. They're bailing out Wall Street, they're bailing out the City of London, they're bailing out Frankfurt and big banks in Frankfurt. They're not helping the middle class. Our house prices are falling, our pension assets are falling, and we are angry. These differential effects on asset prices are quite substantial. This is a picture from the book, and basically just focus on the top panel. But basically what we show is that, so we measure the policy responses of governments to big financial crises right back until the early 19th century. And what we find is that governments, by and large, in the 19th century adopted a very hands-off approach. Asset prices collapsed in big crises in 1826 in Britain or 1907-8 in the United States. Governments didn't do anything, more or less. By comparison, from the 1970s and 80s, and particularly in the GFC, 2007 onwards, we saw massive bailouts of insurance companies, all big banks with the exception of Lehman Brothers. Interventions in asset markets, purchases of bonds by central banks, in some cases purchases of equity, stock assets and so on. So a big shift away from what economists like to call budget, that is very limited interventions, a budget rule, towards bailouts that of course were linked to the kind of anger that a lot of people on so-called Main Street felt after 2007. This is a picture of, again, the United States, of what happened to asset prices, measured very broadly here after 2007. They collapsed, equity prices in green, by about 50%, but within a few months, they were rising very sharply again. So if you're a very wealthy, so the upper middle class and the very wealthy, remember, have a lot of financial assets in things like equities, portfolio wealth. These people have been on a boom. Their wealth has gone up quite dramatically ever since. House values, however, really important, remember, for the middle class, not for the very wealthiest, have stagnated and took a long, long time to recover. And there are still a lot of angry people with houses often worth less than they used to be, including less than they paid for in some cases, who voted for Donald Trump in 2016. This is a picture of 4 or 5 American cities, and again, the divides within countries like the United States, very apparent in this. So this is the trajectory of house prices again since 2006, the peak of the house price boom in the United States. House prices fell in San Francisco and Boston, 2 of the great knowledge cities in the world economy, but have since dramatically recovered, and San Francisco is as expensive as it's ever been. Really difficult if you're not a member, if you're not in the knowledge middle class. New York would, I didn't want to overcomplicate it, New York would be up there too. But if you're in an old declining manufacturing center like Cleveland or Detroit, the value of your house on average is less than it was still in 2006. These people are not happy. And of course, people in these states connected and regions and counties connected to some of these declining cities, again, voted for Donald Trump. In the middle there, that's Pittsburgh. That's the Rust Belt to riches story. Again, you know, house prices not at San Francisco levels, but they've shifted away from old steel industries and so on, and they've got a new business in robotics and other things. So, you know, all is not lost for the old Rust Belt in these countries, but we have a number of cities rather at the bottom. Now, why do people, so I've made some insinuations about, you know, people being angry, suffering wealth shocks, voting for people like Donald Trump, voting for Brexit. There's a lot of people, and you may have heard of Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart's book, Cultural Backlash. A lot of people argue that people vote populist because of a kind of cultural backlash. That cosmopolitans in big cities who favor very liberal policies on family, marriage, religion, they don't want religion in schools, they want to allow same-sex marriage, all of these progressive political values, cultural values, they argue there's a backlash, particularly by the older generation, against these kinds of progressive values, and that's what's driving populism. The problem is that lifestyle attitudes have always been different. Remember back to the 1960s, perhaps some of you, and the riots and the generational gaps that emerged in the 50s and 60s in many advanced countries. Attitudes towards lifestyle and religion are pretty stable, so they can't really help us, in our view, explain the big increase in populism more recently. And they can't explain why in some countries we see a lot of people shifting towards populist candidates and parties and not in other countries. Where attitudes have changed in areas like my country first or not, trust in politicians and these sorts of things that we can measure, it's impossible to separate this from economic factors in our view. So, for example, again in the OECD survey, if you're likely to say no to whether your voice counts or not in the political system, or whether the elite listens to you, you're also likely to be situated in a declining area, in a declining population, and so declining occupation, and so on. So it's very difficult to tease out what's culture and what's economics in any of this. In any case, much of the existing literature and academic work in this area has focused very heavily on income shocks due to globalization, the China effect. Lots of imports flooding into rich economies. Immigration in places like Germany, Sweden, and so on. and the way in which these workers in turn become resentful towards immigrants, towards people who are poorer than them, and act in, and particularly are increasingly attracted to politicians offering protectionism and nativist rhetoric. People like Donald Trump, people like Mr. Orban in Hungary or Boris Johnson in the UK. But we think that wealth shocks also matter. So as I've already suggested, and this is in a sense a summary of what I've said, wealth-related anxiety has been increasing a lot already before the crisis. As the cost of education, the cost of healthcare and other things have risen, as competition for houses and good schooling has been rising over the past few decades. And if you're in the squeezed middle class, and after a big crisis, your wealth suddenly collapses, or in many cases in the United States, for the lower middle class, your wealth becomes negative. You're likely to end up pretty angry and pretty frustrated with the political system. And you may increasingly be shifting towards populist parties. Fiscal austerity often comes after crises too. In the UK, in the case of the UK, on average, fiscal austerity after 2010 by the Cameron government took £150 away from every household in London. Not much. In Blackpool, one of the declining British cities that voted most strongly to leave the European Union, lost £1,000 per head. So about 7 times as much. And if you roll that out over a whole regional economy, that's a massive negative shock. So austerity too has had a powerful effect. And this has what people call a Geo Tropic Effect. That is, it reinforces the perception that places like Blackpool are being left behind, while rich people in London are being bailed out by the government and not suffering from austerity. And locking these declining communities in. It's really difficult if you come from a poor family in Blackpool to move, because moving to London is incredibly expensive because they have San Francisco-style house prices. And accessing the education and so on that London can offer to escape poverty and community decline, really difficult. Meanwhile, there's been policy convergence between left and right in a number of countries. Tony Blair in the UK, from the centre-left, pursued welfare state reform, financial deregulation, all of the things that led to the financial crisis that broke in Britain in 2007-8, just as much as the Conservatives did. So a lot of these people in left-behind communities with wealth shocks layered on top of this long-term structural decline go, these people, it doesn't matter whether I vote Labour or Conservative in Britain, they're both the same. So I'm going to vote UKIP. And I don't care if Europe really isn't the problem. But given a chance, I'm going to vote for a populist outcome. And of course, it's very difficult for people to detect precisely what the source of their problem is. It's complex. Globalization is complex. The shift away from old Fordist-style manufacturing towards knowledge economies, these deep structural shifts, the impact of China on your job and your income prospects. It's really difficult for people to understand. But it's really easy to see something as dramatic as the global financial crisis in 2007-8, and really easy to understand that the British government did nothing to protect your community. In fact, compounded the long-term decline that your community had been suffering. Now, just so it's not all about Britain and the United States, this is a picture of Latvia. Since 2008, the dark bars is voting for populist parties in subsequent post-crisis elections in Latvia, rising quite sharply, as you can see. The dotted line is real house prices, which fell by half in Latvia after the global financial crisis. Equity prices fell even more sharply. These people are squeezed in a big way, and they have defected from mainstream political parties. This is a picture of Brexit and house prices from some other academic researchers. And again, lots of dots, but I will summarize it for you. Basically, it says that if you're in a place like London, so you can see perhaps over here, if you're in a city like London, if your house price appreciated a lot as we move further along to the right here, by 5 times since 1996, you were very unlikely to vote Leave in the referendum in 2016. If your house price stagnated in the City of London, if you're in a poor suburb, an underprivileged suburb, you are very likely to vote Leave. House price is really important in the Brexit outcome. And we see, whether we look at regions, we see the same negative relationship. The propensity to vote Leave is very strongly connected to house prices. This is a picture of the United States. Since 1983, the bottom 40% of the American population suffered a massive collapse in their wealth. They suffered no income growth. So basically the mustard-coloured lines show income growth for different segments of the population. You're doing well if you're in the top 1 to 5% or the top 10%, but it gets significantly worse as you move down the income and wealth distribution. And these people basically in the middle and the bottom part of the middle class have suffered complete collapses in their wealth, particularly in housing wealth. This is a picture of who voted or who didn't vote for Hillary Clinton in 2016. And basically, what it shows is that, so there's a line, which actually you can't see, that goes basically up to the right. Again, as we move out to the right, house prices are rising more rapidly. And as we go down to the left, house prices are either stagnating or falling. The red dots are where the house price change since 2012, the last election, before Hillary and Donald Trump went head-to-head. The house price change is less than average or median wage growth over this period. So if your house price is stagnating relative to wages, which is an important consideration in affordability and so on, then you are more likely to vote for Donald Trump. You're more likely to defect from Hillary, from the Democratic Party and vote for Donald Trump. So again, the same effect that we see with Brexit in the UK. House price stagnation, more people voting for the opposition, and in this case, a very populist candidate. This is a picture, again, from someone else that shows that basically Donald Trump's vote was very, very strong in places that were small and increasingly impoverished, being left behind. So small towns, rural areas voted heavily, these counties voted heavily for Donald Trump. Big cities, Los Angeles, New York, Boston and so on, big, booming cities, they all went Democrat, but that's where Hillary Clinton piled up all her votes among the knowledge workers who were benefiting from this new economy. The left behind went for Trump. These people distrust government, they distrust welfare. Unfortunately for them, so do the rich people in the booming cities. They distrust government and they don't like paying taxes to redistribute income downwards to the left behind. So the United States is in a real political dilemma. This is, Danny Quah is not here, but he uses these kinds of diagrams. This is a picture of America at night, big cities, more lights. Very strong correlation with where, in blue, people voted for the Democrats. In red, in small towns, so that's just a geographic indication of this distinction. Finally, this is some of our recent work, and this will be, this is very academic stuff, and I'll keep it very straightforward, or try to. If you suffer a severe, so this is across 58 countries, 58 countries in, again, 450 elections since 1980. So we pull all this together and we do a statistical analysis, and we try to account for things like the China shock, for immigration, for shifts in economic structure. So all of the things that other people associate with populism and the shift towards populism, when we account for all of those things, we still find that house price collapses are really important in driving populist voting. Compared to having no house price collapse, if you have a severe and extended house price collapse, the levels of populist voting on average are about twice the amount than they would be otherwise. The same is true for equity price shocks. Indeed, again, a bit more than half. If you get a collapse in equity prices, like in Latvia, you saw after 2008, people shift towards the extremes and abandon mainstream political parties. Now this, I promise, is where I'll finish. So this is a pretty bad news story. And it's not easy for academics. So academics like me sort of specialize in pessimism. So the world's going to hell in a handbasket, we're all doomed, and so on. So is there anything, and some ministers who I've had the privilege of meeting here this week have said, well, okay, but what's the policy implication? What do we do about this? Well, you don't, as has been the case, I think, among a number of politicians, you don't keep talking about cultural values and cultural differences. That's the road to ruin, I think. And unfortunately, too many politicians in North America, in Europe, Australia, and elsewhere are focusing on cultural conflict. The idea, to say that populism is a product of older people who just don't like the values that younger people have or that cosmopolitan cities have is really not very helpful, because there's not much you can do about that. Well, you could try education, adult education classes, but it's not going to get you very far. For these, think again about the kinds of people in the United States who marched in Charlottesville and who made arguments in favor of far-right politics. These people are not going to be convinced by education anytime soon. Now, if, as we've suggested, post-crisis wealth shocks have a really powerful effect on populist voting and on the polarization of politics and on foreign policy and everything we can think of in terms of the global order that we've all benefited from, that Singapore has benefited massively from, that Australia, that China has all benefited massively from. How do we retain this? Well, we need to accept that if it all falls apart again, Ralph said, if not, it's when, not if, the next big financial crisis comes. We need to accept that so many people have such a stake in the financial system and in financial stability that we will have to bail it out again next time. So just get used to it, I guess. But don't use those kinds of bailouts to delay structural reform. And that, I'm afraid, is basically what most Western countries have done since 2007-8. They bailed out the financial sector and the middle class. They used quantitative easing to make us all feel happy, to keep house prices and equity prices propped up. And they didn't worry about the big educational divides, the infrastructure divides, the rural-urban divides that are literally tearing our political system and societies apart, destabilizing foreign policy globally, and making all of our lives a hell. We need to address these income and wealth inequalities. We need to think about how we can reduce these rural-urban divides, these generational divides, through public housing policies, educational access, lifelong learning. Now, Singapore is well ahead, so you should feel somewhat self-congratulatory in some of these respects. But this is what a lot more countries should be doing, and I'm sure Singapore can be doing more as well. We have to focus much more on crisis prevention, because bailouts are inevitable, there's too much at stake, and therefore we have to stop them from happening. And I think this is a reason a lot of people are saying, well, maybe we've tightened the screws on the financial sector too much. But I think I've suggested to you today that the populist threat is really serious. And beyond all of the economic reasons for stabilizing the financial system and preventing crises, we have very, very good political reasons for ensuring that the financial system doesn't get out of control again, and for engaging in prudential policies that actually stabilize the system in all of our best interests. Thank you.
Thank you.